website that will explain more about him than I could do without taking a lot of his time. But he has a long history as an advocate, speaker, writer, and consultant. Mr. Carley's spoken on issues related to human resources, corporate diversity and inclusion, Fortune 1000 companies, as well as to healthcare organizations and universities. Meehan is frequently in the media. He's appeared in NPR documentaries On the Spectrum and Off the Rails. He's been with NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and The Infinite Mind, which was hosted by Frederick Goodwin, who is the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. In addition to having been quoted in numerous print publications like the New York Times, the London Times, Washington Post, and he's been on news programs with ABC, BBC, HuffPost Live, Newsweek, and Fox News. He also sits on the board of directors of Next for Autism, which was formerly New York Collaborates for Autism, and the advisory boards of Gallup, New York City, and Chase. And Chase is interesting. I had to look it up. I wasn't familiar with it. But it was inspired by a young boy with autism who was named Chase. And luckily, his name was a great acronym, and it stands for Community Help for Autism Spectrum Everywhere. Mr. Carley's addressed the United Nations, was one of 2 people with autism to address Congress in their first ever hearings on autism. He's the recipient of numerous honors and awards, and he brings a unique and especially valuable perspective to his writing and speaking. He's not only a professional knowledgeable about autism and its impact on individuals and families, he's also the parent of 2 sons, one of whom was diagnosed with autism at age 4, in November of 2000. And as Ron Popeil will often say, wait, there's more. Also in November of 2000, Michael John Carley was diagnosed as having autism. I could go on, as he's advocated not only for those with autism, but also as a veteran, an individual who worked on the Iraq Water Project, and a successful playwright. He and his family left the Big Apple after decades, and they now reside in more laid-back Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he focuses on his family, his work as a school consultant, and his writing. And luckily for us, he still finds time to be out on the speaking circuit, which is why he's here. So please join me in welcoming Michael John Carley as this morning's keynote.
First off, I want to just throw a disclaimer out there, which is not Russ's fault. But obviously it's a heavy word. I am actually not a veteran. I had a prior career as a very minor league diplomat operating out of the United Nations, and I represented, as their UN rep, a veterans group called Veterans for Peace. It was the left of center veterans version, and did a lot of foreign relief endeavors on their behalf in places like Bosnia and Iraq before the invasion. So I didn't want to, take that moniker on. Thank you. It's really cool to be here. I have to apologize for a couple of reasons, one of which is I'm really loud. I'm a person on the spectrum who seems to have no regard for sensory assaults, but I'm just really loud. So if I'm booming you with this, maybe if there's a sound person that can tone it down just a little bit. And I also might seem very bouncy to you because there's a camera focused on this podium, so I have to stay at the podium. That's going to drive certain parts of my body a little crazy, so just to let you know, if you see me kind of fidgeting or what have you, that's what's going on. I also want to thank the conference organizers, Susan and Mary, very, very deeply from my heart, not only for bringing me here, but because of the perceived high-maintenance PowerPoint guy that I can become. I like to tweak the PowerPoint presentations leading up until like 5 minutes before the presentation. And they're like, nope, send it to us a week before, we're gonna have to load it in. So I've sort of sent them different versions. You're the best, buddy, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And of course, I sent them a different version last night. And of course, looking over the materials this morning, I was like, it's 2 things I gotta throw out there. Shoot. First off, it's so cool to be amongst a group of librarians. I hope you're not insulted by thinking that people on the spectrum regard you as kindred spirits as well as great supporters. So thank you, this is really, really kind of fun. And I have a slide actually about library type stuff. It's not going to be anywhere near as informative or eloquent as the real librarians that you'll be hearing later on in this conference. But I had forgotten maybe the most important thing that I could have put on that slide, and that was a lesson that I had actually from my days at the United Nations. And that was that the best definition for whether or not an individual lives in poverty was something that I heard at the UN. And that measuring stick was internet access. And I think that the more you think of yourselves as the providers of that, I think the more you will realize how important the work you do really, really is. So please try to keep that in mind. We have always, it's almost been cruel to some people at GRASP, which was an organization I founded way back in 2003 and which became the largest membership organization in the world for adults on the spectrum. And we had this little ethical conundrum that we had to work over, whereas if somebody would say, well, you have to send us print materials, and we would think of all the labor that was for a struggling small nonprofit, and we would think, no, we're going to force people to use email, to go to the library, to use internet access. You can imagine we had some lively conversations about civil rights, etc. But the measuring stick by which we decided, no, we're going to have people have to go and set up the Yahoo account or a Gmail account, actually Gmail wasn't around back then, at that library, because inevitably that will benefit their lives. And the last thing that I forgot to put in, which I feel like a complete moron for, is that I always have a slide that has my email address up there. And I give this to you because I don't like to do the handout thing. It makes me look really green to say that. I'm not doing it because I'm really green, I'm doing it because I'm really lazy. But in essence, my email address, if you would like a PDF of the presentation that you're going to see here today, is Michael John Carley, all one word, no dots, @gmail.com. And I'm saying it to you at the beginning of the presentation because it really should belong at the end of the presentation. Because like right now you might be thinking, oh God, who is this guy? Is he just going to talk and talk and talk and talk? I'm not taking down his email address. And then later on, of course, hopefully you're like, oh my God, that was the best presentation I've ever seen, and I forgot the email address. So I don't want you to have one of those moments. So, Susan, are we going to go with the hand thing to shift the slides? Is that okay if you just watch my elbow? Okay, you're going to get carpal tunnel, and I'm going to get bone spurs. Okay, you ready? All right, let's do it. Okay, we're gonna the fonts did not translate, I told you. But that's okay. I know. This is the outline of basically what we're gonna cover today. Okay, we're gonna talk about a little bit about a setup, general overview, what's the situation on the ground, kind of a thing. The autism job mess. I have been asked to definitely take a lot of what I'm telling you here today from my second book, Unemployed on the Autism Spectrum, especially because I think you're going to be a great resource for those unemployed spectrumites. And the schools that prepare us, we do have to fit other aspects of transitioning into that, so I want to talk a little bit about schools, especially even though this is a national conference, I would like to sort of share with you my experience as a school consultant in a very different atmosphere here in the Midwest, where I now live for almost 3 years, as opposed to the 28 years that I did this or whatever in New York. And then we're going to talk just a few side issues. We're going to talk socialization and relationships, sports, disclosure, libraries. You might think, what's sports doing out there? Well, I'll tell you when we get there. And then we will just basically do a closing for perspective, and if we have time, we'll do a Q&A. So, situation on the ground, okay? We have to remember we're talking about a condition called autism right now, which is a heck of a lot more complex than most of the other things that you'll read about in a DSM, okay? There have been many mistakes made by many organizations as they try to come up with these ideas about this is the face of autism. Because as our good buddy Stephen would say, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It is a diagnosis that truly befuddles our very human desire to compartmentalize and to be able to put things into drawers. If you have Albert Einstein, Ludwig von Beethoven, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Edison, Emily Dickinson on one end of this spectrum, and yet you also have a lot of people that might never say a word or have an intimate relationship or hold down a steady job for a long time as all being part of the same condition, that messes a lot of people up. Okay? They really have a hard time figuring that one out, and just on an internal subliminal process condition processing that. I actually think that in the end it will be better for it, because if we learn that we can't compartmentalize, and that if we can't control some things that are just out of our control, that if we're learning to let go and put it in a bubble and forgive and say it's okay, let it be more complicated, then I actually think that's good for all of us on a human level. Still got some issues with the DSM-5, which is also up there. But it is our new thing. I am now diagnosed with autism, not Asperger syndrome. But we also have to remember that the DSM-5 was a very, very messy book. Lots of controversy, lots of arguments. The clinical world did not come out of it as the shining example of emotional health that we need them to after their process in building this particular book. So we've got nowhere near adequate school placements available. I'm sure everybody's pretty much associated with that. That's just a financial issue and money. A plethora of butcherous clinicians. What does he mean by that? Well, with all the autism awareness that's going around, especially the high prevalence numbers, we have to understand that in a large capacity, autism awareness is really in itself becoming its own economic market. And if you're that, let's say, not so ethical, clinical professional that if one of my guys calls up and says, do you know your Asperger's? And he's a therapist who really knows their Asperger's. And, you read the page out of it in DSM-4, so you're like, yeah, I know my Asperger's. For just as we may need to be taught differently, so too in a therapeutic context where we need to be treated differently. And so very often, irreparable damage can come from this. And I will be the snooty New Yorker who complains that in my new home in the Midwest, I have found the level of clinical diagnoses to be absolutely deplorable, sloppy, lazy. I am still telling parents that ask me, where can I go to get a reputable diagnosis to get on a plane? Okay? Back where I come from, granted, we're spoiled. Okay? If you mess up on somebody's diagnosis, you pay. Somebody's going to take your client and who lives right next door, and your professional reputation is going to suffer. Here, it's like the Wild West. Anybody can say whatever they want. There's no accountability whatsoever amongst the clinical community, I found out here, and it's been a real struggle for me almost 3 years into my new home in the Midwest. 1 in 68, those are the current prevalence numbers. Somebody was tossing about a 1 in 48 that didn't really have enough studies behind it for me to put it on this slide. But I mean, honestly, this number is going to keep growing until basically we realize that, all this stuff is like a big warehouse that needs to be cleared out before we're really going to know what those numbers are. How many people who are incarcerated, okay, are on the spectrum that we never knew about, okay? How many people in their 80s who, were misdiagnosed and given, misprescribed pharmaceuticals, which had side effects which led to further misdiagnosis, which led to further misprescribed pharmaceuticals, and, they've been at a home somewhere for 80 years or what have you, and could have had a pretty fairly decent life had they grown up in the times that we grow up in now. This is a massive can of worms that we're never really going to know what those proper numbers are. And they're also going to continue to grow because as we progress as a society, and we become more behaviorally pluralistic, okay? The brilliant guy doesn't have to be the sexiest creature on the planet, but we're not getting beaten up in the movies by the good guys like we used to, okay, way back when. Times have changed. And what happens if an individual is accepted more and more, albeit slowly, into the American dream? Well, they're allowed to date a lot more, and then they procreate a lot more. So our numbers probably, I'm not going to give you the whole science fiction thing of join us, but our numbers are probably going to continue to grow. What's out there for adults? Parents who are in the audience obviously will know, or will not know maybe, that whatever struggles you had to get your kids the services that they deserved or are entitled to, that's nothing of a struggle compared to what's out there for adults, because comparatively, there's nothing out there for adults. We have problems too in the autism world. We fight, probably because of that vast discrepancy when one end of the spectrum has polar opposite service needs than the other end of the spectrum, who may need to get rid of their services as opposed to getting more services. So we fight a little bit in the autism spectrum, and I wanted to give you an example of that, which will have a quick quiz. I'm going to show you a picture in the next slide, don't show it yet. And I want 3 people who are brave to immediately give me the first word that comes to their mind with a hand signal. Go. Quick. Yes? Incarcerated. Asleep. Meltdown? And I'll give a 4th. Sorry? Withdrawn. Deprived. All right. The woman in the picture, her name is Amanda Baggs. And she is a nonverbal person with autism, but she blogs. And if you're an executive director of a peer-run group like I was, she can be a giant pain in the ass sometimes. I will be perfectly frank about that. But man, will she teach you stuff if you listen. She truly, truly will. She took this picture and she wrote the material that I'm going to read to you now, based as a protest off one of those "This is the face of autism" campaigns that went out there. This is what I look like when I'm trying to relax or zone out a little or shut off vision so that I can hear what is going on around me. I have no doubt that someone could use this image to show the tragedy and despair inherent in autism. Black and white images such as these and the captions that go along with them are designed to create a reaction. Most often, disability organizations run by non-disabled people use them to elicit pity and money at the expense of the truth. Look at the autistic person in her own world, they say. Isn't it tragic? What I am doing in this photograph is no different than someone curling up with a good book to unwind after a long day. Some autistic people would even say that it's bad to publish pictures that look like this. Better to publish the ones that make us look like real people. Those are the better pictures. I say that plays straight into the hand of people who think there's something wrong with the way we look. And that is a slide of famous names of folks diagnosed on the spectrum that was just taken from 3 books. There are more books with more famous people diagnosed on the spectrum that are out there, but I just took this as a little encapsulate, okay? Now, granted, diagnosing the dead, it's a little bit of an arbitrary science there, okay? But usually, the diagnosis is arbitrary anyway. We don't get this diagnosis from a blood test or an MRI. It's based on perceived behaviors. So I have no problem with these famous folks' behaviors were written down methodically by their very puzzled peers and colleagues. I have no problem diagnosing them whatsoever. This is a little drawing that I made up years ago, which basically was mathematically proportional to the actual funding dollars that were being spent on all these various types of organizations. The planet's size is proportionate to the budgets that they received. Now, obviously, you know, it's kind of a demonic thing to say procure, but that is just kind of the way we felt about them. You know, autism speaks, as well as, you know, some of the other, you know, even more cuckoo ones that were out there. But I've also done the emotional manipulation thing where I've put those organizations in the dark. You know, they look like the Death Star from Star Wars. And of course, my old organization, GRASP, is, you know, sitting there in the light, basically. So, and you also had national parents organizations being pushed out of the picture, which especially, you know, like 15 years ago was really what was starting to happen as people were taking stands on some of the more controversial issues, and they had these memberships that were based on balancing, you know, the two sides and straddling the fence on a lot of the complicated issues. But I wanted to show you actually in the next coming slide how we all get along together. Okay, we fight in the autism. So the fights we fight about are things like language, like the word cure, okay, the vaccine debate, aversives, and for those of you who don't know what aversives are, it's basically what restraints you can put on somebody who might be nonverbal and sitting in a home somewhere. Research, what kind of research? Okay, we all talk about, oh, autism research. Isn't it all good? Well, let's do an examination. What kind of research are we talking about here? Are we talking about serotonin levels and nerve synapses, you know, to go get at the root cause of autism? Because that's what gets 95% of the funding. It's a great project for parents who have all their kids' service needs already met. Okay? It's a love child of the wealthy, and that's not necessarily to paint a negative picture of it, okay? But 95% of the parents out there don't have their service needs being met. And we would like to see a lot more of these research dollars steered into, let's say, the less glamorous scientifically, but much more needed service needs. The first ever congressional hearings on autism, which if you look at them on C-SPAN, were a circus. And of course the DSM-5, which I already talked about. So let's move on now. That's the situation on the ground. Everybody's thinking downer material. Yeah, well, it kind of is. But at the same point, that kind of chaos and that kind of disunity, okay, is a good thing to keep in mind as we progress along, because that's just kind of the state of things. Unfortunately, I would not say that we are a true community whatsoever yet. And I don't think we necessarily should be. We have issues to iron out first. So when we talk about a lot of things that are going on with employment and autism, there's a general sense of great excitement that's going on right now. It's a subject that's really in the news quite a bit, and by all means, we need to start, painting a picture of what the unemployment numbers really start to look like, what the challenges are, and this is getting actually pretty accurate and good coverage. But sometimes I get a little worried about our slowing down because we think things are in a good state because of all this positive attention that a lot of organizations are getting. And some of those organizations are listed as Specialist Sterna, and you're going to hear from Thorkel later on. Aspiritech, which is a software testing firm in Chicago, which is not too far from here. Ultra Testing, which also does software testing in New York. The Non-Pariah Institute in Texas, which does a variety of things. And ASTEP, which was my old stomping grounds, obviously, in New York. And we basically negotiated relationships with Fortune 500 companies there to sort of bring a lot more Spectrum folks into their companies than would have before. So these are, and by no means are we going to dispel the good work that these organizations are doing. Okay, but what do we mean by mess? This whole slide is basically going to be a math equation for the math brains out there. Let's look at the fact that if these handful of programs, and I'm estimating that all of them together, combined, provided 100 people on the spectrum, at most, with full-time employment last year. If these programs all put together providing, 100 people, remember that number, and if we could calculate that the working age is 21 to 65, that there's a 75 to 85% unemployment number for people on the spectrum in a nation of 319 million, and that the prevalence rate is 1 in 68, that means that there's over 2.6 million people that need assistance to get full-time employment. And we've done 100. Large companies, we're going to talk about large companies because that's where we usually look to solve all of our employment problems. Large companies have entire departments dedicated to preserving civil rights, inclusive practices, and equality on their job sites. They are called diversity and inclusion departments. How did we once, or how do we still, actually we really still, it's not once, but it's heading away from this. Define diversity and inclusion. Gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disabilities, and veteran status. Those are kind of the big 7 right now. With one exception, the unifying principle is legal compliance. Does anybody know what that exception would be? Guesses? Which one? Veterans. Carrie is right. My old friend from Brooklyn is absolutely right. There's no law that states that you have to hire veterans. There's a lot of an emotional push, but there's nothing legal stating that that has to be a part of it. And in practice, my guesswork only, how many diversity and inclusion departments are really actually doing things in the areas of gender? I would say 95%. Race, I would say 98%. Ethnicity, about 65%. Religion, 70%, although it's predominantly Christian. Sexual orientation, it's a number, it's 45%, but growing. Disabilities, I'd say about 10%. And veteran status, about 8% because PTSD just really scares a lot of people. So, employee resource groups, these are little collectives that exist inside these large companies. They are also called, in our world, support groups, and that's exactly what they're intended to do. If you have an employee resource group for your African American men, then in a white-dominated, let's say, company, those African American men can get together, share things that they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about with the rest of their colleagues, and be able to have that sense of shared experience as a smaller number than everybody else. Same with Asian American women or veterans, if you have on the job. Actually, no, yes, veterans. However, if we have an employee resource group for people with disabilities, then we might have somebody who uses a wheelchair. We might have somebody who is hearing impaired. We might have somebody with Asperger syndrome, and we might have somebody suffering from chronic depression. And there's not a lot of shared experience that can come from that. So this is kind of the infinitely more complicated member of diversity and inclusion. And part of it is that we define disability in a couple hundred ways by my calculation, and maybe more. I won't give you all of that, but we can cordon things off into two categories, the first of which is visible disabilities, physical with mobility limitations or sensory with hearing and vision. And then we have non-apparent disabilities. We have things like mental health and depression and anxiety, physical health, diabetes and epilepsy, learning disabilities such as dyslexia and ADD, developmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorders. So there's a lot of breakdown that can be done, which really helps, I think, to clear up some of the subliminal mess that disabilities kind of presents for these large companies. And the more that we can share this breakdown with them, the more that we can make them feel confident that they can make the relationship work. And that's what I'm going to be talking a lot about today, is the confidence that these companies need to make that relationship work. In 2010, 411 Fortune 5000 employers were asked about employees with disabilities. A third perceive employees with disabilities to be more dedicated and less likely to leave the job. So you probably can't see too much of this slide, but I'll give you a hanger here. Under dedication, there's a large green section. Don't worry about that. That is where 62% of those polled said that there was no difference between their employees with disabilities or their employees without disabilities in terms of job dedication. But they did say 35% said that their employees with disabilities were more dedicated, whereas only 3% said that they were less dedicated. And over here in turnover rate, and if you ask any HR manager, have you got a dollar sign for every turnover? And they will say, for this position, it's this amount, for this position, it's this amount, for this position, it's this amount. And in large companies, believe me, this stuff adds up. And in turnover rate, again, avoid the green, where 58% of employees said that there was no difference. 33% of these employers said that there was less turnover amongst their employees with disabilities, whereas only 9% said that there was more turnover. Okay, now obviously this wasn't taken in Silicon Valley, but just to get your brains working here a little bit, you know, this is a town that we basically built, right? So it's important to understand the numbers there, where we actually might be the majority, you know, could be actually vastly different. But why is there a fear of non-apparent disabilities amongst these companies? For one thing, there's the disclosure aspect of it. Not a lot of the companies we find are actually really trained in terms of how to handle disclosures. Accommodations. This really makes a lot of these companies freak. They just subliminally seem to go to the idea that it's going to be a $30,000 price tag for any employee with a disability who requests accommodations. And then there's the ADA. And the ADA, for those of you policy wonks out there who know probably more than I do about it, but ADA underwent some revisions a couple of years ago. And really the biggest change was that ADA went from how you qualify for services based on whether or not you have diagnosis X. But now it's more the severity of diagnosis X. It's not a particular diagnosis that will grant you rights or protections under the ADA. It is more about the severity of each condition. And just to give you just a couple of quick things about ADA that I think a lot of people don't, realize, because you do still have to be qualified for the job. This is the bad news for people on our end. Individuals with disabilities have to be able to fulfill all the functions of the job description. Must be able to perform the essential functions of a job with or without reasonable accommodation. And of course, those of us who have been through this ringer before know that that word reasonable is really gray area. And of course, we'll end up, being solved by the lawyers, which stinks. Must disclose the disability to receive accommodations. And that is the difference between a non-apparent disability and a visible disability, because the whole point being that you could maybe hide it. And therefore, it's not apparent to an employer that you have that disability. You have to tell them. You have to disclose that you have that disability, and there are a lot of ways to do that, and maybe a couple of ways not to do that. But we'll talk about that later. Accommodations must be reasonable and not present an undue hardship. Again, gray language there. It's also not IDEA. Sometimes that's a bit of a downer news for people that have been through the school system. Under IDEA, the big difference is this. IDEA means that the school has to come up with the accommodations or the solution that will make the relationship work and that will create an environment in which that particular child succeeds in the school environment. But after school, when you're in ADA territory, which is either college or the workplace, it's up to you to come up with those accommodations as to what will work for you in the workplace. Some of the other laws in the US, which just briefly, there's been attempts, especially during the Obama administration, but they just kind of fell flat because they weren't really well thought out. There was one piece of legislation that said there have to be 100,000 people with disabilities working in federal departments. But everybody assumed that the IRS would take all the 100,000, so the other departments didn't do anything. They should have done it department by department, and this roughly adds up to about 2% of all these employees. And another one was where that they proposed that 7% of the employees of an organization that has a federal contract over the amount of $25,000, that 7% of those employees had to be people with disabilities. This was too much. Even I will tell you that. Okay, we don't even have 1% yet, and 3% would have been enough of an improvement. And to say 7% was it just freaked out all these companies. I mean, if you're Lockheed Martin, you're thinking, holy cow, it's just it's a terrible scenario. The other thing too about the legislation was that it said that it had to be 7% in each department. So 7% of the mailroom, 7% of sales, 7% of upper management. It was kind of crazy, I mean, in a really great way, but didn't have a chance. And Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is sort of like the ADA's grandfather, is a good piece of legislation to investigate as well. The crisis versus opportunity is that 75 to 85% unemployment number, though. I mean, if we're going to really be able to press the very true and not crunchy granola fact that a lot of our folks have real potential in the workforce, then we have to use this particular number as an opportunity for employers. Okay, it's a downer for us, but it's an opportunity for them, and we have to sell it like that. So, if all this is true and all these employees are great, and that Forbes study, by the way, we've been waiting for data like that for a long time. So when it came, we were just like, yes, we finally have the answers. So, why aren't the businesses hiring now? Now that we have all this data that proves all this stuff. Lack of training, strengths, challenges, the accommodations of these employees within the workforce. It's again that confidence aspect. The employers have to feel confident that they can make the relationship work. One thing that's very important to understand, especially if you're coming from the nonprofit world, that in the for-profit world, they don't get credit for nobly trying. They get fired or demoted, and it's a stain on their resume. As an executive director of nonprofits, if I'm looking over somebody's resume and I don't see some cool but giant failure, I wonder if they're willing to take risks. I wonder if they're brave. I like to see a big giant failure on something really noble on somebody's resume. But in the corporate environment, it's just very, very different. They can't have that. The top-down initiative. It's a noble gesture when a group of secretaries want to start a parent support group in hopes that it will eventually raise $1 million for their favorite charity. But this isn't really the way it usually works, especially with autism, if not other disabilities. It's always going to be, have the easiest road to doing some real good for that particular condition if the head of that company is the person who has a kid or has it themselves, and it has some personal connection, and all the way down. Love of leadership? Please. Big companies don't want to lead. This is a fallacy and a farce that people still believe. Look, I know you walk into their offices and they have all these slogans and all these really just gag me phrases about leadership, okay? They're always wanting to be second, not first, because they don't want to take the risk. Let somebody else take the risk, and they will quickly jump in, because they're watching to see how it works. They'll jump in to be the second or the third almost immediately, but they want somebody else to take that first step. The other thing we have to realize on our end is they don't have to hire our folks, because we don't have those 7% laws, or 3% laws, or 2% laws. And even if we had them, probably we would have trouble enforcing. So we have to understand that they are still in the driver's seat, that we have to make them feel comfortable with all these changes. And sometimes our salesmanship of the subject I put a bad word up there, so I put it in like little underlines and stuff like that. But our salesmanship has been, well, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. Or you should do this because it'll be good PR for your company, which is sometimes true. But really you want to be able to frame this in the context that the company will grow and that your company will be better for it. Retention. There's hiring and then there's retention. And these are two totally different sciences. There are three types of a non-apparently disabled employee. Undiagnosed, diagnosed and undisclosed, diagnosed and disclosed. Obviously diagnosed and undisclosed means that the individual knows what he or she has, but will not share it with anybody in the workforce. So why aren't the businesses retaining them? Now, it should be pointed out, actually, and I should have had a bullet point saying this, but remember that today we're in the days where diversity and inclusion numbers matter. And more is this becoming important to corporations because they like metrics, and they want to have those numbers to be able to at least say that they're looking good. These numbers are manipulatable. We can talk about that a little bit later on. But in essence, this is now the day in which companies want to be able to say that they have employees with disabilities or non-apparent disabilities as well. However, this sort of a jump from wanting people who have disclosed on the job is so short a time frame from back in the don't ask, don't tell days that in a lot of ways it's just been too quick a jump. Okay, we've really gone from I don't want to know it, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to hear about it, you know, to yes, please, do you have Asperger's? Please tell me, my numbers suck. They don't know the warning signs that someone might have a non-apparent disability. They also legally cannot suggest that a condition exists, okay? An employer might actually know something about autism or Asperger's, and they may, you know, have a good read on one of their employees who doesn't know that they have autism or Asperger's. But that employer cannot go to them and say, hey, you should have a look under the hood for autism or Asperger's. That is very, very illegal. And they're not certain of what accommodations they can maneuver. You know, there's again the cost thing, which freaks out a lot of HR people. And another thick complaint, which just makes me sick, but you hear it all the time, is, well, I don't know what the coworkers are going to think. If they see, you know, Joey, you know, getting special accommodations, they're not going to deal with their resentment. No. That's, you know, we don't deal with that. And they can't successfully tap into increasing D&I numbers because they can't earn the employee trust needed for disclosure. Because that's the key word, is the word trust. If you're that individual, you are sharing information about yourself that makes you very vulnerable in a lot of different ways. And that's where the onus is on the employers, is to earn that trust, and not to just be able to ask for that trust. A fear of what to do when an employee discloses, okay? That's actually kind of another sort of hidden fear with a lot of managers and HR people is, oh my gosh, what do I do if somebody actually does disclose? If you ever talk to one of those managers or HR folks, you can tell them that the best way to start out is you ask the question, how would you like me to handle your disclosure? And you take it from there. So why should businesses want them to disclose? The cost of accommodation is so much lower than typically feared. Employers estimate that workplace accommodations cost, on average, less than $500 for an employee with a disability. The ability to discuss solutions with them, okay? That's huge. Something's going wrong. You know the guy, again, you know the guy's got Asperger's or autism, but you can't talk about it with him, so you have to talk behind his back about the issue and about how to make it work. Whereas if that individual has disclosed and it's a good working relationship, they can have that conversation together, and that individual can provide input as to how best to make the relationship work. Every study indicates that companies that are more diverse have been proven to outperform their peers. That, to me, is like the big kahuna right up there. And that has to do with all of the elements of diversity and inclusion. And especially up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where I live, I know it's an easy liberal thing to say, but there really just are so many organizations that are nothing but, you know, white guys. It's just really bizarre. What would help convince an employee to disclose? The trust factor. Trainings for managers and colleagues, thus convincing the employee that their differing behaviors and histories will not be used against them. Okay? Supervisors, colleagues, HR staff demonstrating an understanding of, maybe even a respect for their condition. Seeing other elements of D&I accommodated, valued, and respected. So, what that means is you want to work in a place that's kind of cool, if you're that spectrum individual. And if you see, okay, your company hasn't put out a presentation about autism spectrum stuff to make you feel comfortable enough to disclose, but let's say, they do a really fantastic LGBTQ presentation, okay? And you're like, well, it's not my thing, but at the same point, they are trying to be more diverse, and that's kind of cool. So that gives me a little bit of a baby step. The secret to businesses addressing 90% of the challenges, okay? And this is really complicated stuff. I hope you can understand it. The challenges on our end in terms of getting a job are many. Job skills training, we're still struggling to have appropriate job skills, especially for more challenged people on the spectrum. I am an advocate of getting rid of this equal education stuff in the cases of certain individuals and getting rid of the 12th grade curriculum, if not as well the 11th grade curriculum, and teaching trades, just like we did in the 40s and the 50s. I think the people on the spectrum, a lot of our more challenged kids would really respond well to that. They would have jobs that were probably a lot more secure than their college-educated peers for a long time. Especially, do you know what welders make now? You pass one test and you got a six-figure income. College programs not addressing the social. Okay, they've learned, okay, there's money in the Nar Hills with these smart kids that really test well. But if they don't address the social needs of these kids as well on these campuses, really bad things have been known to happen. Keywords. A lot of times I think that when we're training people to go hit the job market, especially with large companies, that they use keyword search software when they filter out the resumes. We hope in our dreams that H&R people are looking for great resumes as their first inclination. They're not. They're looking for the giant stack of resumes to get rid of, first and foremost. And that comes helpfully from electronic means. They will have keyword searches that want to see words like implement or devised or created, corporate speak words. And those words are going to be different with each company that is important to them. So the language that's used, you should do a little bit of a lesson on corporate speak. I wish I could find it for you actually, because I'm so proud of this example of corporate speak that I made up in here. But of course, if I knew it really well, wouldn't that be nice? Innovative materials, baloney, be boring. Okay? When you can put your resume together, we don't need the creative font. They want to see that you are just as much a sheep as anybody else. Don't listen to what they say on the Apple commercials that you see on TV. Okay? Maybe if you're looking for a graphic design gig or a job that really calls for such creativity, but use a basic font, create your resume just as boring as everybody else's resume that's out there. And they'll, understand that you're willing to listen to instruction and be the sheep. By the way, just for, clarification's sake, I've never worked in one of these places. I would die. So. Interviews. We put a lot of emphasis on the interview process, maintaining eye contact, all this sort of jazz about reciprocal conversation and waiting for our turn to speak, etc. I don't want to shun this particular type of work, but in my experience, if we're having to struggle that much to get through this stereotypical 30-minute corporate interview, I don't think that individual is going to be at that company for 30 years by any means, if it's that much of a struggle. So it's just something to think about, as I think we've overemphasized the interview process a little bit. Maybe we need to start thinking outside the box. Networking, all right? I know everybody on the spectrum hears it, but it's just a fact. Who hires strangers? Very few people hire strangers. So those cold resumes, they don't have that same result that we dream it would. And the LinkedIn generation, we have to remember something about LinkedIn, okay? LinkedIn is not a source that creates jobs. Maybe two, but not like we think it does. What LinkedIn is a fantastic resource for H&R professionals, for human resources people to find qualified candidates, whereas in the past, they really had to scrounge, and if they ended up with the 4th best candidate for that particular job, they were thrilled. And now they always get the most qualified or most available candidate, thanks to LinkedIn. But if you are that 2nd or 3rd most qualified individual that's ready for the job, in the old days you had better luck. Whereas if you're the most qualified today, you enjoy the way things are. And like we're still doing things that are all based on socialization, which for individuals on the spectrum is just going to make us either not do well in the context or basically abdicate. Like college recruitment, which is almost always based on like social gatherings. And if you're the brilliant IT guy, and you know that this is going on, you're going to be like, you know what, I think I'm going to just stay in my room because the sensory assaults are just way too much during those functions. I'll just be in physical pain. So the challenges are in our end with keeping, as opposed to getting, would revolve around things like the hidden curriculum, executive functioning, sensory issues, and an inability or discomfort towards disclosure. And I'll just go briefly over what all those mean. The hidden curriculum was coined by Brenda Smith Miles as understanding unstated rules in social situations that make us fit in. It's information that most people learn without having to be taught. It's nonverbal communications such as gesture or tone, unwritten rules that most people understand, and knowing what other people might be thinking. So, in the whole sense of us being as too literal, if Johnny really is literal and the boss tells him, here, take these papers, I want you to kick it upstairs. Johnny might go to the stairwell and actually go boom, okay? So that's part of the hidden curriculum. The management strategies for the hidden curriculum are actually not so difficult. And this is sort of a lot of what we did at ASTEP, was teaching these strategies to the managers. Clear communication, write it down. No euphemisms, no sarcasm, no soliloquies, be clear. Detailed job descriptions, okay? We wanted job descriptions that just weren't based on a template of other job descriptions. Believe me, I've seen a job description that said, need data entry person to work in a cellar with no windows, very little human contact, must produce 10,000 entries per day, and then at the bottom it says, strong leadership skills preferred. Limited use of idioms, we just went over that. Mentoring, okay? If you've got that spectrum individual working at your company that has succeeded within that company, boy, does that individual have a role within that company. And hopefully gets a few extra bucks as part of the diversity and inclusion team as well. Rules help, and the importance of how they're delivered also helps. Again, just trying to be clear and not leaving the individual worried about how far can they go. Structured work environment for most people on the spectrum really, really helps. So the executive functioning issue is mental processes that allow us to plan, organize, strategize, and pay attention to and remember details. That includes organizational skills, multitasking, prioritization, time management, transitions, focus, and the big kahuna of what, quite frankly, I feel would make life so much easier for everybody on the spectrum if it wasn't such a challenge sometimes, and that is emotional regulation, okay? But some people call it meltdowns, okay? But that inability when you've just had a harder time of it than most people, and suddenly enough is enough. And a part of you says, just like anybody else would, I quit. Because life is going to be harder on an individual who has those sensory concerns and who struggles with the hidden curriculum or other executive functioning issues. Can be seen as short-term memory challenges sometimes. If you look at all of these challenges here that are on this screen, now in the old days, if you came across that employee that displayed all of those, how would you refer to that employee? You'd call him stupid. You'd say he was slow. You'd say he was lazy. And he'd be out of a job very, very quickly. Can be seen, not prevalent in all spectrum individuals. Yeah, executive functioning issues are very interesting. They present a lot of us are absolutely fantastic at some of these qualities that are listed up here, actually. So it really depends on the individual here. The management strategies for executive functioning are clear communication, write it down. Detailed job descriptions. Flexible work hours really help, okay? If it's too much stress, go take a walk around the building for 10 minutes. 6-10 minute breaks in a day, the individual works an hour later at work, boom, problem solved. Mentoring, again, structured work environment, including those breaks. Solutions revolve around going slow, employees taking notes, and supervisors providing written instructions. The hidden thing that we actually also like to say to a lot of these companies if we're teaching them to become better communicators is that we're making them better communicators with their other employees who aren't non-apparently disabled as well. The sensory stuff obviously is sight, sounds, touch, smell, and taste. And the possible accommodations for sensory challenges might be lighting adjustments. Okay, if you're one of those individuals that gets headache from fluorescent lights, that would certainly help. There are other workplace adjustments, having to do with folks that really just don't like the sounds or the cacophony of sounds. Noise canceling technology, a lot of people, in work environments you see today, wearing headphones, which really works for a lot of folks. Flexible work hours again, and a lot of times also telecommuting. A lot of businesses are realizing, why do we need to spend the money on the real estate of putting this person into an office when the person wants to be home anyway? So boom, problem solved. So the other thing that I want everybody also to remember that, in these contexts, maybe it does kind of stink to be, an individual on the spectrum trying to gain employment that will, God forbid, feed a family. But the one thing that I think our side also has to remember is that right now, everyone's challenges at getting a job we're still in a period of unemployment for the rest of the world. I know we've had a recent bump, and it's bigger than that 6.5 number, which was the truth a little while ago. But I still want to just share with you a little bit about how no statistics lie like labor statistics lie. Okay. Number one, the long-term unemployed, okay? Those people who are 55 and older, they are not taken into account into those statistics. Discouraged workers that have been tracked through, let's say, if you're getting unemployment benefits from your local Department of Labor and your benefits run out and you still don't have work and you just kind of said, I quit, okay? You're not taken into account in those unemployment numbers. A much larger percentage of our citizenry in the United States is seeking disability now, okay, than existed before. And it is because they can't find regular work. And if you are seeking disability, guess what numbers you are not taken into account for? Those unemployment numbers. Job growth, salaries. When you hear, like every time Scott freaking Walker in Wisconsin says, I created a bunch of new jobs, and I look at those jobs, and it's barely above Taco Bell staff, okay? We have to stop allowing people to lie like this and call these jobs that will never be able to provide for a family. Because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about employment and fulfillment and independent living and the American dream. It's not about working for barely above minimum wage. That just cannot cut it. Changing professions versus inadequate high school and college curriculums. A lot of times our schools have not, developed, the engineers that they needed to develop. When I was in college, we used to pity the poetry and philosophy majors because they would never make a dime. Now we can pity the political science majors, the history majors, and the English majors as well, in addition to that. And the colleges really have not, accommodated the changing job market. In the old days, we had this really racist practice of paying people from China or India a much lower salary because they were, really qualified for a lot of these engineering jobs to come over here and work here. And because they wanted to come to America, they just dealt with the lower salaries or what have you. Okay, now we pay big bucks, okay, to go over and recruit those folks. We're not racist anymore, which is really great, but at the same point, it really does show how inadequately we educate our folks for the job market that actually exists. Global economy, okay? I love the idea of a global economy long term. We have to understand that if this is what we really want, though, there's going to be some short-term cost. And the short-term cost is that, those jobs do get farmed out to India as opposed to staying here at home. That's just part of the process if we're really going to do that. Everyone's challenge is at keeping a job, not just the spectrum, keeping a job, okay? There's no more job protections anymore. There's no more unions anymore. Okay? The old adapt or die, okay, if you're a watchmaker, or do you still have a business because of how, changing professions have happened? Will these large businesses be the entities that save us, which is the premise that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so? And oddly enough, if you look at all the studies that people that know a lot more about labor than I do even will tell you, is that no. Large companies are expected to plateau and maintain roughly the same number of employees over the next 10 years. Small businesses, that's where our potential growth is expected to be achieved. And if you want a particular profession that is supposed to go booming in the next 10 years, it is healthcare. So meanwhile, if any of your folks, or folks that are unemployed, part of what you could really help them out with is starting with a conversation about how we sort of treat ourselves when we're unemployed. This whole book really started from, there was this one conference that I went to, and it was a conference where I wasn't just allowed to speak and go back to my hotel room and chill out or stuff like that. I was really gonna have to schmooze because it was a conference on corporate giving. And I was one of only 2 nonprofits that had been allowed into it. So, there I am with all these massive heads of their corporate foundations. I'm basically going to run around and just say, please give us your money. So it was like honestly, it was like a dog in a butcher shop. It was really cool. But I had to socialize more. So, and I'm an individual on the spectrum. I wear out socializing, but I can go as long as I need to. I just need a proportional amount of time to chill out afterwards. That's kind of how I've always worked. And in this one, I really needed to be out a lot more. So I went out one night with a bunch of people, and didn't really work out. Everybody's pairing off, they're getting drunk. I don't drink, so it's like, I'm not the best schmoozer. And I ended up with this one woman who was originally from the Philippines. She was very young. She was like very short, and we were sitting at this marble top bar, and it was like her head was kind of just like barely up and above. And when I found out her position, I was kind of like, she's kind of nice, but I should probably go home, or go back to my hotel room and stuff like that. She's not really in charge of her corporate financing. She's just here to assist the other person who was. And we were situated in this bar that was at the very tippy top of the hotel. And outside, you could see the city in just magnificent splendor. There was, the shot of the river with the bridges. It was night. It was just this beautiful scene. And everybody who was at that bar was just kind of reveling in how cool it was. To be, at the top of this bar, in this kind of cool setting, and, outside everything was going on. And then she and I started talking, and we disclosed a massive discomfort that we both shared. And the massive discomfort had to be that it was 2012 or 2011, and the city we were in was Detroit, Michigan. So what was happening down there on the streets and in the city wasn't so beautiful. And they were in the midst of their, biggest economic hardship. And so we talked about that, and we talked about a lot of things, and we started talking about unemployment. And she had a comment which really started the book, which was, I don't understand you in America because, when people get unemployed in America, they stay at home and they just send resumes out. And they have this weird expectation that they have to get the same job that they had before, and they have to get the same amount of money as they had before. Whereas where I come from, if you're unemployed and you go out and you work for 5% of what you made prior, yes, there's going to be trouble paying the bills, but in terms of your status and how other people look upon you, they worship you for that. Whereas they would not worship somebody who was staying home and just sending resumes out. I was like, wow. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And it really does have to do, it starts, I would say, in terms of individuals, because there's a great amount of stigma in this country about, you can do anything you put your mind to. I'm here to tell you that's horseshit. It's not true, it's not fair, okay? There is such a thing as economic freedom, and we do not have it in this country. It's simply unfair to tell people that, because what it leads to is shame when bad things happen to us, and that has to stop. One, it's not good for the individual. Two, it's not good for the entire country. It's making us belittle greater problems that we have in the unemployment sphere. It's making us do a whole host of really harmful things to us, not only as individuals, but as a collective. There's lots of things to do when you get unemployment. You can learn that trade. You can become that welder. You can become that plumber. You can learn a lot of different things during this time. Lesser work, the minimum wage aspect of things, volunteering, to meet new people, to at least be doing something. There isn't 10 hours that you need to be spending every day on sending those resumes out. That's going to take you 3 hours a day at most. You can do that during your off time. And what we need to do is get off the couch and stop watching, binge watching the latest Netflix series, okay? And get out and doing more things like that is going to be a lot more productive to that individual's spiritual development, as well as solving their unemployment faster rather than usual. Again, looking into small businesses where there's real growth, looking into nonprofits if you've only worked at for-profits before, expanding your horizons that way. Exercise, meditate, eat well, sleep well. This all has to do, keeping a regular schedule. Okay, this all has to do towards the well-being of the unemployed individual. And more, I got 2 slides of this actually. Take your freaking benefits. Don't give me that pride thing of, well, I'm good enough, I don't need to. Take your freaking benefits. Move, you could move. Could you move to a place that's less costly to live or has more employment opportunities? Are you desiring a change in your life? You want more fresh air, or you want more hustle and bustle? This is an opportunity. Okay, learning to budget in a big, big way, that's obviously going to help a tremendous amount. And a lot of times this is opportunity. If you're somebody without kids, okay, and you're talking about, not only starting your own business maybe, if you have kids or don't, the no kids thing is for the get in the car part, but creating that startup, going back to school, or again, if you don't have kids, getting into a car and just getting out there. I lived for 5 months out of a car as I went across country as part of finishing my graduate thesis. And it was one of the best experiences I ever had. I was big on adventure when I was a kid. Eastern Europe for 5 months in 1986 as well. Momentum. That's really the key word towards overcoming unemployment, as far as I'm concerned. And the moments that you take off to watch that, Sopranos, 20 episodes in a row type of thing, those are when the little gremlins come in and they start to eat away at your momentum and they stop it. And then you have to generate it again. So the more you keep it going, that to me is the secret for overcoming those unemployment issues. Parents, if there's parents that you talk to or that are in the audience, okay, there's a couple things you can do. You can stop planning for 5 years ahead and you can start planning for 15 years ahead. You can also, go to the adapter die and really look at how the landscape has changed since you were a kid. And you can also work with your head and not your heart. And I have a great example that actually started with the Bedouin tribes for how to work it for your kids, because they're very big on, placing their kids somewhere, as opposed to their kids going out and doing it for whatever. Now, this is strongly adapted, as you can see, as you'll see here soon. But a mother goes up to her son who has just left school and said, "Son, I'm going to arrange a marriage for you." And the son says, "No, you're not. I'm going to pick my own wife." And the mother says, "I'm going to have you marry Bill Gates' wife." The son says, "Oh, okay." So the mother then calls up Bill Gates and says, "I want my son to marry your daughter." And Bill Gates says, "Who are you? No, absolutely not." And the mother says, "My son is about to become the head of the World Health Organization." Bill Gates says, "Oh, okay." So then the mother calls up the World Health Organization. And she says, "I want you to let my son become the head of the World Health Organization." And they say, "No, who are you? Are you crazy?" He's about to marry Bill Gates' daughter. Okay, now I'd like to take a little bit, we're away from the autism job mess, just a little bit about schools, and because this is a huge part of the transition process as well. One of the things that I've had to learn as somebody who school consulted maybe 5 to 10 hours a week for like 10 years in New York, and who now does that for half his profession here in the Midwest, that I've had to really, really sort of wrap my head around. Can I just see a show of hands actually of how many of you actually live in the Midwest here? Okay, good. Okay, it's the majority. Because I knew there were a lot of you from vastly different places and stuff. So good. Okay, this will happen. So the whole notion of the Midwest being like so inclusion-based was really, really foreign to me and very new to me. And I will confess to you that in our snooty New York ways, as we sat and we watched you all sort of going full inclusion out here, that we made fun of you a little. We did, sorry. You know, we sort of said, oh, get the pom-poms out, yay, we're all one big happy family, yay, team, go. And so then I moved here, and I started scouting around, and I will confess to you that I actually did buy the Kool-Aid, especially on a theoretical level. I'm not somebody who's ever really cared about grades at all. I just want emotionally healthy, happy human beings leaving school. And while this does put a bit of a sacrifice, which I'm sure a lot of people complain about in terms of the grades, I actually like the ulterior benefits that if an inclusion environment really succeeds, that will happen, you know, because of that as opposed to a traditional special education environment. So I'm going to give you 3 examples right off the bat, not from anything I've done, but from my one of my best friends in the business, Barry Prezant. His book, Uniquely Human, is an absolute must-read for parents and for educators that he's created from his 50 years or what have you from school consulting. And it's some of the detective work that you really have to do as a school consultant in terms of behaviors. And he tells the story of being out in the boat with a friend of his who had a son on the spectrum. And the son on the spectrum ran up and down the bow of this boat and yelled, "No dogs, dogs bite, no dogs, dogs bite." And now, whatever the assumption might be, if you were hearing that for the first time, I can't really answer that question for you. You'd have to answer that question for me. But Barry inquired, and what it meant was that the son was afraid of dogs. And so as his cue to be able to ask his father, is it safe to jump in the water? That was what he said, no dogs, dogs bite. And then when his father said, no dogs, the dogs don't bite, his son jumped into the water and had a really fun swim. No recess. There was a girl that Barry had been told hadn't been to recess in 2 years. And her teachers all really thought that they were doing the right thing by the kid, and spiritually they were doing the best they could, because they figured that there was just something so sensory awful going on during this recess period. You know this example? No? Okay. That was just going on that prevented her from enjoying it, and so they kept her up, away from recess. The girl was nonverbal, so they had to do some, their own, detective work and their own thinking. And unfortunately, they had it wrong. She was just afraid of butterflies. And 2 years ago, one butterfly had sat on her shoulder and had freaked her out. And so everybody kind of panicked, and she spent 2 years indoors without recess. Evan and the license plates. There was a kid who could not be steered towards any of his academic work because he just had an absolute spectrumite fascination with license plates. He loved to walk through the school parking lot, and he would just watch all the license plates, and he would study them. And so they couldn't get him to do any work until a brilliant teacher comes along who says, we're just going to focus all of his projects around license plates. And his first project was a social studies project where he would take pictures of the license plates, and he would put alongside that pictures of the people who owned the cars, and he would write little descriptors about them. And suddenly he was off and learning. And one issue that I had here in the Midwest, this is from my experience, Jack is one of many kids that I've encountered that is very, very big. He's 6'3", he's something like 245, and he's kind of scary to a lot of people. And the big guys, but it's awful because the big guys, there are different rules for the big guys, and it's not fair. They get treated so bad because everybody's just freaked out about them. And Jack is barely verbal. And I took a group of kids, including him, on one excursion out to the mall. My feeling at this particular school was that they were not getting the kids enough community time whatsoever. So I took them out there, and Jack really did struggle. He was like, I'm at a mall, and I'm not going to be bought an Auntie Anne pretzel. So he made a little bit of a scene, and then he wanted to use one particular bathroom as opposed to all the others, and made a little bit of a scene. And when we got back, the consensus among everybody there was, well, that proves it. He's not ready, so we're not doing that again, And my contention, which I would like to thank them because they listened to me, was no, it's the opposite problem. He needs to go out into the community more, not less, much more. So it's what insurance and police departments are for. Chill out. Understanding a student's perspective and experience rather than simply trying to manage behavior. Okay? There's a very fine line between the cool behavioralists out there and the not so cool behavioralists out there. The cool ones roll up their sleeves and they do their detective work. The not so cool ones are like, fix it, fix it, fix it. Make the rest of the world's job easier. And that's 98% of the behavioralists in Wisconsin. Understanding what is not within a teacher's ability to control and what is. One of the things especially that I find I'm doing, I don't know how it is in Illinois, we were having a conversation earlier that Minnesota and Iowa, who are pouring money into public education, and Wisconsin, you have the most just Kafkaesque, draconian campaign to demonize public education that starts at the top. And the teachers don't get stuck up for, there are salary freezes. I tell any teacher, if you don't have kids, get out of here. Okay? Go to Minnesota, go to Iowa, or what have you. But they're good people and they want to do right, but they don't have the sort of training. And so in essence, I'm trying to always tell them, you got to check out when you check out of here. Every once in a while, wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, sit on the edge of the bed, wonder if you're doing the right thing. That's cool, but not every day. Not every day. Because the schools are underfunded, and it's just, without those kind of supports, the quality of education is quite low, which makes the ammunition for demonization even greater, of course. And there's that question of trust. And love is sometimes not as synonymous with trust as we make things. Now, my perspective as a New Yorker, being here in the Midwest, would go something like this. I would say that in terms of inclusion design, theoretically, you guys are way ahead. But as a con, I would say that you are way behind in concepts of self-identification and self-advocacy. So few kids know what they have and speak about it with pride as compared to the East Coast. We New Yorkers think we know everything. Obviously we don't sometimes. You all don't have that problem. Money is the issue here, okay? The one thing that I did, however, realize, and this is a very important point, is that if you were to under-support a traditional special education environment back east, okay, there's going to be a little bit of damage to that program, obviously, but it's going to be okay in the end if you were going to underfund it. Because they know what they're doing, they've got the actual physical spaces to handle a lot of the issues that might come up elsewise. But if you underfund an inclusion environment, okay, disaster. Absolute disaster. And that's what's happening in Wisconsin and many other places around the Midwest. Okay? Because suddenly the teachers don't know, because they're regular education teachers. We've got to remember that's the difference. Okay? Special education teachers, they've been trained in all this stuff. Regular education teachers have not. So they're going to interpret that spectrum kid as being rude or obstinate or all these things that I had to go through. Okay? And if they don't get that training, which is part of the money issue, if they don't get an assistant, a teaching assistant in that class that isn't just a lump of clay that maybe knows a little bit more about stuff, that can't handle the quote-unquote behavior problem, and then you've got a series of events that ends with the rest of the class's parents demanding that that kid be removed. So it's really awful stuff that's going to happen. Yes, there is a greater sense of community in the Midwest. The only thing about me that I've always said, maybe I'm not such a great New Yorker, is that I'm not very good at every man for himself. I was looking forward to more community when I came out here. There's a lot less than I thought there would be, but there's still a little bit more. And here comes to the larger issue, which I wanted to throw at you, was that long before I moved here, summers in the autism world were often very vacant because everybody went away for the summer. And when we first started GRASP, we didn't know that rule. So we stuck around in the summer trying to get projects done with other people, and we got nowhere because everybody else was gone. And we were the idiots that were trying to get work done, when we should have just been enjoying our summers as well. And Brian King was on the board. No, this was before you came on board. This is one of our first early days. We had this summer and we had it free, and we were like, well, let's just do a study. We're bored. Let's do a study. Let's figure out what's the best place to live in this country if you're on the spectrum and kind of look on our end of the spectrum. And what's the worst place? And we kind of figured that the worst place would be like those white supremacist corners of Idaho, or backwoods Alabama and Mississippi, that sort of thing. Oddly enough, those places are very behaviorally pluralistic. They have a very live and let live attitude towards behavioral eccentricity. Scary, but they're kind of cool with behavioral differences. The Midwest, with all of its educational resources, especially back then, the Midwest wasn't bankrupt back then, as well as the fact that, I was speaking at more conferences back then in the Midwest than any place else in the country. The Midwest was the worst place to be. And here's why. There is a very upheld cultural phenomenon known as the quote-unquote stand-up Midwestern guy and the stand-up Midwestern gal. And there's a lot of pressure to adhere to that behavioral picture. And if you don't adhere to that behavioral picture, there's more consequences for it. They sort of cross the line and go, oh, that's not the right way. And that was stunning, actually, to realize that there was that kind of pressure. So it does put an onus on individuals on the spectrum that they're not allowed to be as they want to be and to feel as they want to feel. And that, I think, has permeated an awful lot of, some of the problems that I've seen out here. And you have to remember something else, too. As somebody who was new to all of this, I studied it. And I won't say that my conclusions are right, but one of the conclusions I was coming up with was that these were Depression-era values that a long time ago kept people alive. They really had a lot of value back then. But the world has changed and those values haven't. And it's kind of like, we need to find, forgive me for saying this, but we need to find a better favorite movie than Hoosiers to rely on for our value systems. Seeing eccentric people running businesses that much around the Midwest? 'Cause I don't. And I think that's a choice indicator for a lot of the struggles that we have here. Moving on to colleges. Just one quick slide on colleges, basically. One of the things that you need to sort of, be keeping in mind if you're choosing a college for an individual on the spectrum is the distance. Will that person thrive in Hawaii because they're so far away from you? Or will they just, shudder up and die? Will that individual really need to be close to home so that you can advocate for that kid? They're not really as good at advocating for themselves, or what have you. Or is that person going to hate being so close to mom and dad? You need to investigate a lot of the social atmosphere on that particular campus. Is it academically realistic? Remember one thing, parents, today, that the whole pedigree of name brand, and this is coming from a Columbia grad, okay, doesn't mean as much anymore today. And that's a great thing, not a bad thing, okay? The whole issue of did you go to, let's say, Harvard or Yale, that only matters to people who are living abroad and sending their kids to this country because those are the only colleges they know about. Okay? Nowadays, it is so much more about who is willing to kick the door down, as opposed to act entitled like that great position is going to be handed to them. My wife, who used to be a bigger name than mine, she was the evening news host for New York Public Radio for years and was the voice of the New York Times for a little while. Catherine Herzog was her name back then. She filed a lot for NPR. And she told me there was one time at the New York Times when she literally had a bunch of Columbia journalism grads and a bunch of SUNY kids from their journalism department in 2 basic classes where she would teach them about how the New York Times offices worked. And she said the SUNY grads were such better hard workers, such better learners, that there was no sense of entitlement to them whatsoever. Okay? Office of Student Disabilities, you need to investigate that for your kids. These are federally mandated offices, although they are exclusionary of colleges that are run by religions, as well as colleges that I believe have less than 5,000 students. But every school should have an Office of Student Disabilities. Some of them really pay a lot of attention to their students with disabilities and do great work. Others, they'll tell the janitor, on Tuesdays, you're the head of the Office of Student Disabilities and your janitorial closet becomes the Office of Student Disabilities on Tuesdays. So do your homework in that capacity also. In my view, New Yorkers, we have so many definitions for what self-advocacy should look like, okay? In my view, it's unfortunately portrayed these days as only teaching, I need help, or I'm sorry. To me, it also resonates with, your only duty on God's green earth is to get the hell out of my way. The key word is confidence, okay? And confidence to me means more than what school you went to. It means more than what resources you have at your disposal. It means more than what your body looks like in comparison to the bodies that are in magazines It means everything. And the great thing is that confidence is a mental switch that you can turn off and on, okay? I'm an ex-baseball coach. I coached a lot of travel teams. I was a college pitching coach for a little while. And we used to have a phrase, fake it until you make it. And I think that actually there are a lot of spectrum individuals that not only need to learn that phrase, but that also do know it. Because they will just demand that they're going to go to college, even though everybody around them is saying that they're not going to go to college. And so they just start ticking everybody around them off by saying, yes, I am going to go to college. And they start to work at it. And even if they fail, and all the grown-ups around them go, see, we told you, that individual is so much better for having tried, for having given it a shot. Because if they just gave up, then they would just be giving in to the low expectations that everybody else has for them. Starting as early as possible, if you really want to help kids out, giving them opportunities to practice independence as much as humanly possible from as early an age as possible. So moving on to socialization and relationships, I would like to start with a little bit of context here though. Do we really want to socialize? And I would like to clarify this. I have not one, I had two Chinese American friends tell me the exact same thing when we were discussing a lot of the work with autism spectrum and socialization. They said, why do you care so much about socialization here? In my family, we just care if you're smart and you work hard. Americans just have this, mega high emphasis, I guess, compared to the rest of the world in terms of how we socialize. So it's just something, all these attributes or deficits, in some people's eyes of the autism spectrum, we have to remember, these are just ideas. Again, no blood test, no MRI. They are filtered through cultural contexts. And in different cultures, all this stuff resonates as being very different. But if you must, you have to remember that there are always going to be different learning styles, and I would contend that folks on the spectrum are either visual learners, okay, like a Temple Grandin thinking in pictures, or they're math brains. They're non-visual learners. And what school you end up going to is also going to play a huge role in your socialization potential later on. Are you going to an all-autism school? Are you going to a special education school? Are you going to an inclusion school, a bridge program, or a regular education school? That also is going to be filtered through it. But my feeling is that common connections are always a great start. Because if you stop worrying about who's going to really be compatible, remember that when we're into something, we're really into something. So unfortunately, I'm an old fart, so it's like video games is usually the answer to a lot of kids, but God forbid it should be something like guitar playing or chess. And if you were to, match up two kids that had the same special interest, that to me is going to be the best possible, start to a potential relationship. Sports. Why would you have sports up here? Well, I'll get there. In sports, we have the obvious physical benefit and motor skills that everybody else gets, okay? Especially if you have motor skills issues because you're on the spectrum, and repetitive motion has the potential to iron out a lot of that stuff. It's the arena where certain emotions are appropriate and where it is safe to apply them, okay? This is important, okay? All the ugly stuff, okay, that sometimes comes out in sports. People learning to be good winners, people learning to be bad or good losers as well, okay? That has to be practiced. And one of the reasons why this slide is up here is because for too long, individuals with many disabilities have avoided this stuff only because the grown-ups didn't want to handle the upset emotions. And that really robbed a lot of kids of emotional confidence for later on in their life. Notions of competition, okay? That's the key thing for me for making sure that kids are involved in sports. If the team dichotomy thing just really doesn't work out because of peer ostracizing, that's potential. If the individual doesn't do so well, then there's golf, and there's tennis, there's lots of other avenues, where if you fail, it's just like you failed on a math test. It's not that big a deal. You can find things for kids to do. But the main thing, too, to understand is that everybody has to be comfortable with competition. Because when we graduate, we compete with other people for jobs. We compete with other people for boyfriends and girlfriends. In New York, we compete with each other for apartments, okay? So it's just a way of life that if individuals with all disabilities haven't been trained in necessarily, they're going to have a very hard time later on. And it's one of the things that irks me about the Midwest too, is because it's like, you guys have different attitudes about certain sports, at least up where I live. It's like you're supposed to behave on a field or a court or a rink like you do, I was saying to Carrie, as we were walking over here, like you do in church. And whereas, my younger one, who's the nicest, most well-behaved kid, good student, that you'll ever meet. If he's, on the ice, he's been a travel hockey player for, since he was like 3. And, he'll freaking hurt you. He will really, really hurt you. He's kind of famous for it, actually. But he's a prince off the ice. And that's because he understands that that's the arena where it's safe to do that sort of stuff. And that's wonderful for kids. I got a funny call, actually, too. I did a couple of, I have a Huffington Post column as well as my books. It's called Autism Without Fear. And I've done a couple of columns about sports. And it was really funny. There was one, I got a call out of nowhere from Hayley Wickenheiser. If you don't know who Hayley Wickenheiser is, she is the captain of the Canadian women's hockey team. And it was hard to talk to her because it was like right after, I don't know if anybody remember the 2010 Olympics. Our girls had a 2-0 lead in the gold medal game against Canada, and they just crushed us. It was like one of the most humiliating choke jobs our country's ever done in the Olympics. It's just, I have a hard time thinking of it. And here's the captain of that demise calling me up. I didn't even want to talk to her. And she goes, yeah, actually, I did my graduate work on adults with autism and sports. And they're so much better regulated, when they start out their day like that and everything. And of course, first off, I'm thinking, wow, this is cool, but I'm also thinking, why is one of the best hockey players in the world have to do graduate work in this stuff? This is really crazy. Women's hockey. There's also a school in Houston that has pretty challenged kids. They make them work out like real workouts, not like walking, not like, getting on gym clothes and then hitting a badminton racket a couple of times. Like insanity Shaun T type workouts. First thing in the morning. And they test better than other kids of their ability throughout the day, like nobody's business. And if they have a real test coming up, they do another workout right before the test, and they do phenomenally better, proportionally better than their peers as that level. Okay, again, we're just creating confidence. By the way, no slight to the arts. I just figure everybody knows that everybody needs the arts and that our notions for creativity, it's weird to put a slide about sports but not one about the arts up there. We get that. So disclosure very quickly. I've talked for 5 hours before straight on disclosure. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk for 5 hours today. But some of the things to understand is that it's not such a simple science or art of telling another person that you have autism. There's a lot of things to consider, such as why do we disclose? Who to tell and who not to tell? How to tell? When to tell? And the obstacles are that these are judgment calls, and we, being individuals on the autism spectrum who don't read people well sometimes, we might actually make a few bad decisions about who to tell, how, when, etc. And the other thing that we fail to take into consideration, the other person. How are they going to react if I tell them this vulnerable information? See, I'm so scared to tell this guy that I have autism that I'm hoping he'll take care of me. But I might have to take care of him. I might have a lot of explaining to do. Well, what is autism? What are you talking about? So it's something to not take lightly. My parents. We like you because usually we like to read books and we like to come in to libraries. I'll even tell you actually, at grassroots around the country, we've always advocated that if people, for dating, if the whole notion of, like the traditional dinner date and movie, was just too sensory bad for people, we came up with a lot of creative alternate dates for people on the spectrum to do. And the first one that I thought of was take your date to the library. You can walk around, you can just talk about what books you like, it's a sensory-friendly environment, stuff like that. Awesome. Oh, sensory-friendly, I said that. Merging away from just a place where you check out books. We had a lot of grass chapters across the country. They were housed in libraries. And obviously you, as publishing companies, know that the whole notion of books is starting to become eradicated and that everybody is merging into other things and becoming real hotbeds of community activity with the rooms that you have. And I implore you to keep that going, not only for your own elongation of your life as a library, but also for those communities that you will really help. Redefining who you are. No diagnosis is the bad guy. If you want a bad guy, you're looking at anxiety, anger, and depression. And for us, sometimes it's that element of distrust. I mentioned before that the whole difference between love and trust is something that we sometimes don't see. because we think they're synonymous. But of course we have that brother-in-law that we will never trust, okay, but that we love. And of course we have that college professor that yells at us that we will never love, but that we trust because we know that he or she really knows what they're talking about. And when you're an individual on the autism spectrum, your capacity for trust is severely diminished. Not because you're a bad person, but because nobody really deserves your trust. They get you wrong all the time. You know, one of the hardest things I have to say to teachers or to parents is you have to understand that maybe that kid's an idiot to trust you. Because when they trusted you, maybe you told them something stupid like, oh, having social problems? Just be yourself. Bad advice for kids on the spectrum. Bad advice. And then bad things happen and they learn to distrust you. So the whole notion of earning that trust, making sure that you really get to know that kid, that's what's going to, you know, swerve people. It's not an act of generosity that you can just expect people to give, even if you're the nicest person on the planet. Best description I ever saw of being on the spectrum came from a 5-year-old boy. He had a kind of a good relationship with his pediatrician. They could kind of bust each other's chops a little bit. And the doctor at one point said, I know what's going on with you. You've just got too many wires. And the kid said, oh, back. No, doctor, my problem is that the wires aren't insulated well enough. There are two great words that people on the spectrum almost never get taught as they're growing up. It's starting to improve, okay? But when you're on the spectrum, everybody's freaking out about you getting in trouble or something bad happening to you. So the grown-ups are all freaked out and they're always saying, you have to listen to me because this is important, this is important, this is important, this is important. Nobody's really talking about, oh, this isn't that important. Oh, that person didn't like you? Who cares? I don't like that person either. Not everybody has to like you. That's okay if some people don't like you. Early on in GRASP, I noticed that a bunch of the grown-ups in the audience were struggling with this. So I asked them to say 2 words. So was the first word. What do you think the second word was? So what? And once they all said that, you know what they did? They started giggling. Because it was liberating. And because they hadn't really said that much in their lives. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful to feel. Just in closing perspective, for those of you who have read my first book, Please Keep Silent. Oh, I thought the other thing was there. Sorry, that's coming up. We are talking here today about several aspects of what makes a human. We're talking about gender, we're talking about race, economic background, sexual orientation, neurological makeup, that's what we're talking about today, quality of supports, and culture. Tell me which one of these 7 is by far the most important. Whatever in second place isn't even close. Quality of supports. If you're raised to feel good about who you are, you've got a shot. If you're not raised to feel good about who you are, you're going to struggle mightily. That's my one moment of shameless self-promotion. All right, who said this? Security is a superstition. God, does this have value in times like today? Wall. Security is a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. If you read my first book, Shush, who said that? Give it to him, Susan. Helen Keller. I'm not a Freud guy. Slept with his patients. All his theories are pretty much thrown in the trash now. But Freud had one really, really great thing to say. And that was that if you really want someone to change, then you have to change. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. I failed to bring up here. My creepy looking water mixed with air water.
Don't get feedback walking around. Michael John Carley has agreed to take questions from the audience, so raise your hand and I'll walk around and put my little microphone in your face. And I got a bigger microphone.
I think that also, just to let you know, they need the microphone in your face because they're taping, I assume. So they want to be able to hear your question, otherwise I'll have to do the repeat the question thing.
Raise your hand and I'll walk back there.
the farthest person in the back. Do it up.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yeah, you sure can. Of course I'm the farthest person. Okay, so one of the things that, I work in an academic library. I'm at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So we're huge and we have lots and lots of people always coming through. One of the things that I think we struggle with and we know we're not doing well is how do we communicate with nonverbal patrons? And I was wondering if you have any tips or resources that can help us develop some thinking, develop